into the local army. A time when the government is spending all of its money funding a war, and everybody is dying from disease and in battle. For the Americans of the 1800s, this was a reality. In a little something we like to call the Civil War. If you didn't know, the Civil War started in the year of 1861 and ended in the year of 1865. In the Civil War, the nation was divided by the North and the South. The South was known as the Confederacy, and they fought to keep slavery in the nation. The North, the Union, fought to keep slavery out of the nation. The Civil War was a period with a lot of battle and bloodshed. Many Americans lost their lives. However, before we can get to the end of the war, we must start at the very beginning, before the war even began. And that beginning starts with California becoming a state.
A common debate between U.S. politicians during the 1800s was whether new states should be free or slave states. The Missouri Compromise may have temporarily solved this problem, but debate sparked once again after the Mexican-American War and California Gold Rush. Due to this, Whigs and Democrats against slavery formed the Free Soil Party, a party dedicated to keeping slavery out of new states. In 1849, California applied to be a free state. Luckily, Henry Clay presented a new compromise in January 1850. In his compromise, California could be admitted as a free state and slavery would be an option for territories won from Mexico in the future. The compromise was made official in September 1850. However, the compromise strengthened a previous Fugitive Slave Act from 1793. Government officials could force ordinary citizens to assist them in the capture of slaves. The law even denied fugitives their constitutional right of trial by jury. Northern states were so angered by this that they passed new laws to protect runaways. While enslaved people from Africa were no longer being imported, the children of current slaves helped increase the slave population. Slaves suffered terrible conditions in plantations, yet slave owners still tried to justify by saying that slaves were better off with them than on their own. Racism and racist laws affected 250,000 free African Americans by preventing them from their First Amendment right of assembly. In the South, slavery was so essential to the economy and culture that Southerners even tried to convince the government to get Cuba from Spain to add to the nation as a slave state in the 1854 Austin Manifesto. In the North, many people were just as racist as the people in the South. Even some abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery were racist. Segregation was common in northern cities, and segregation laws prevented African Americans from having the same rights as white people.
Unorganized condition of the Central Territories complicated everything. They would have to be organized into new states. New states could upset the free state and slave state balance. Douglas introduced a bill that solved the problems. He wanted to separate the territory into states Kansas and Nebraska. He also called for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. He did not go over if the states would be free or slave states, leaving the decision to the people. The law was signed in May 1854, labeled the Kansas-Nebraska Act. His intention of peace had caused a harsh battle between the people. Free Soilers organized in Kansas to grow the population of Free State supporters and secure its status. Thousands of border ruffians illegally entered Kansas to vote against them, despite the already prevalent Southerner population. Pro-slavery forces dominated the law and passed laws against abolitionists. Anti-slavery settlers made their own government and constitution. The two forces gained materials and support from their allies. In May 1856, slavery supporters raided the Free Soil town of Lawrence, Kansas.
The Republican Party was formed by Whigs, Democrats, and Free Soilers in 1854. It was dedicated to preventing the expansion of slavery in new U.S. territories. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, a slave, sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled against him, saying that African Americans were not citizens and had no right to sue. The court also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, arguing that Congress could not legally ban slavery anywhere, which outraged Northerners. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to spark an armed slave revolt, but failed and was executed. While the raid terrified Southerners, it turned Brown into a scapegoat for the abolitionist cause in the North.
In the race for Illinois Senate seat, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas engaged in many debates. During the fourth debate, Douglas attacked Lincoln by saying that Lincoln favored racial equality. Since many Northerners disagreed with that, Douglas was sure it would benefit himself.
The election of 1860 was defined by the collapse of the Democratic Party due to deep-seated divisions over slavery. Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas and his platform of popular sovereignty, while Southern Democrats insisted on federal protection of slavery, eventually nominated John C. Breckinridge. This internal fracture prevented the party from presenting a united front against the Republican opposition.
John J. Crittenden tried to be a peacemaker in the South Carolina secession. He proposed the Crittenden Plan, no abolition in the slave states at all, and the Missouri Compromise line would be spread out completely, bisecting the U.S. in slave and free states. Many people from the North and South supported it, but Republicans like Lincoln disagreed expanding slave states. Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861. Becoming the 16th president, Lincoln clarified his goals to unify the country again. Abraham Lincoln's victory in the 1860 election upset Southerners. They did not want a president like Lincoln who didn't support slavery. South Carolinians were so distraught over this victory that the legislature gathered to debate the idea of seceding South Carolina. South Carolina became the first state to leave the Union on December 20th, 1860. In the following months, 10 more states joined South Carolina in what became known as the Confederate States of America.
Abraham Lincoln declared secession illegal under the Constitution. Southerners wanted to secede because Lincoln was a threat to the slavery institution. After leaving the Union, Confederate states declared that anything within their boundaries was rightfully theirs, including Fort Sumter. The Battle of Fort Sumter began the Civil War on April 12, 1861. The Confederacy capital became Richmond, Virginia. The states that lay between the Union and the Confederacy were known as border states. These included Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Also, it included West Virginia, but it was added to the Union later. Neither sides were very prepared for the war, but they tried their best to mobilize quickly. Lincoln tried sending forces to take Richmond. First, he ordered his general to attack Manassas, Virginia, but there was a delay. The Confederate general stationed in Manassas found out about this and called for help. Thousands of soldiers came to back him up. Union forces crossed the creek to attack Confederate soldiers, which is when the First Battle of Bull Run began. The Confederacy won that battle, but the casualties were heavy. The Civil War divided families. People from the same family would often be on opposite sides of the war. Even Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law was a general in the Confederate Army. Rifles replaced muskets with less accuracy and range. With weapon advancements, soldiers used trench warfare. Trenches offered cover when soldiers were fired at and offered a good place to shoot from. Naval technology also upgraded. Ironclad ships were built to withstand more ammunition. Many women worked as nurses during the war to take care of wounded or sick men. On the Union side, Dorothea Dix led a march on Washington in April 1861, wanting women to be allowed to assist the Union. The Secretary of War then allowed Dix to recruit nurses. Over 2,000 women volunteered. Clara Barton, on the Union side, delivered supplies to soldiers and cared for Union soldiers and their Confederate prisoners. The Union had a navy and more ships than the Confederacy. The North had a military academy, West Point, the best in the country. The South fought mostly by defending itself, which meant most of the fighting occurred in Confederate states. This gave the South geographic advantages. Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army, developed a plan that he hoped would end the whole war. He wanted to use his Union warships to block Confederate ports along coast, which would prevent weapons and cotton exports from being delivered. Scott also suggested sending forces to the Mississippi River to capture cities and ports. The blockade plan was risky. The coastline was over 3,000 miles long and they had less than 40 ships to get it done. The plan became known as the Anaconda Plan. Lincoln ordered for the plan to be carried out and it worked somewhat. Both sides in the war had many geographic advantages. The Confederacy had fought mostly on familiar ground. The South also grew copious cotton, which was sold to cover war costs. The South supplied 77% of Great Britain's cotton as well as most of the world's cotton. The Union had a larger population and a wider area. The North had much more people fighting and more large cities. The South only had 2. The Union had more than 2 times as many miles of railroad tracks. Both sides used railroads for shipping, but the Confederacy's railroads weren't in as good shape. The North wanted to capture the western region of the Confederacy because it had some of their most important ports and cities. Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, Union generals, sailed up the Tennessee River with 19 riverboats. 7 of them were gunboats. The fleet captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. The Union tried reaching Corinth, Mississippi, where more Union soldiers waited, on February 25th. It was a railroad center, and they could control much of the western region of the Confederacy if they captured it. General Albert Sidney Johnston, that region's Confederate commander, heard about the Union's plan and ambushed the Union forces in Shiloh, Tennessee on April 6th. The Confederacy drove them back, but by the next day, more Union forces came and Grant managed to lead a counterattack. Lasting 2 days, the Battle of Shiloh was the bloodiest of the war so far. The Confederates lost over 10,000 men, which included Johnston. The Union's goal was to capture Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. On June 1st, Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army, protected Richmond. There was a second battle at Bull Run in 1862. General Robert E. Lee marched to Bull Run to battle again. After 3 days of battling, the Union soldiers retreated. Lee moved his troops into Maryland, hoping he could move the war into the north. Lincoln told McClellan to defend their capital. The Confederate Army met the Union soldiers at Antietam Creek on September 17th. The day of this battle would later be called America's Bloodiest Day. The casualties for both sides were over 23,000 men. General Burnside tried to take his troops back to Richmond to capture the Confederate capital. To reach Richmond, Burnside marched near Fredericksburg, Virginia, to cross a river, but by the time he got there, Lee's army had already destroyed all the bridges. The general ordered Army engineers to build makeshift bridges using pontoons, but the Confederacy shot at the Union engineers as they built them.
After Antietam, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in American history, President Lincoln sought to define a greater moral purpose for the Civil War. He realized the Union could not defeat the Confederacy without first destroying slavery. Abolitionists pressured Lincoln to end slavery, but Lincoln envisioned ending slavery more gradually. Northern Democrats warned Lincoln against the social, economic, and political fallout of ending slavery, as they felt sympathetic to the Southerners. Union troops secured slave states of Missouri and Kentucky by the summer of 1862. 5 days after the Union victory at Antietam, Lincoln submitted a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet and officially issued the 5-page document allowing slaves to be free and the Union to accept said freed slaves into its fighting forces on January 1st, 1863. The proclamation did not apply in the Union's slaveholding border states. The Emancipation Proclamation allowed African Americans to finally join battle. African American soldiers faced the same challenges as white soldiers, yet they still received lower wages until June 1864, when Congress granted equal pay to all African American military units. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Robert Goldshaw, consisted of over 1,000 African Americans. On July 18, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment prepared to storm Fort Wagner, which guarded the port of Charleston, South Carolina. Shaw led them over the walls, but were met with 1,700 Confederates waiting for them. There was brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed, and 281 of 600 of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment soldiers were killed, including Shaw himself. William H. Carney became the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Both sides had trouble getting people to join battle. The Confederacy issued a draft saying men ages 18 to 35 needed to join the military for 3 years. The Union issued a draft, the Conscription Act, saying men ages 20 to 45 were liable to being drafted. However, on both sides, wealthy men could just pay their way out of service. People were so angry about draft enforcements that they began to riot. African Americans somehow became the perfect scapegoat, and white people killed African Americans and destroyed their homes. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and over 14,000 people were jailed for disloyalty. Neither side was prepared to fund a war. Soldiers needed food, shelter, transportation, uniforms, weapons, ammunition, and medical care. Union and Confederate leaders discovered loans, new taxes, and the invention of paper money. In August 1861, Congress passed the first federal income tax in U.S. history, requiring citizens to pay a portion of their income to the government only if they made more than $600 per year. Congress replaced individual bank currencies with one national currency in the 1862 Legal Tender Act. Greedy manufacturers took advantage of federal funds and urgent demand to produce defective goods. Some uniforms would fall apart in rain or have no buttons, while some shoes had cardboard soles. Suppliers mixed sawdust in the gunpowder that filled the artillery shells. Dishonest businessmen also profited off of giving spoiled meat to Union troops. Today we are here with an expert on war camps that were used during the Civil War. Tell me, what do you know about Camp Douglas?
Camp Douglas was a camp in Illinois. Many prisoners died due to lack of medical care. The camp was poorly sanitized, had bad weather, and gave reduced rations, all things which contributed to prisoners contracting pneumonia, smallpox, or scurvy.
Yikes, Camp Douglas sounds really bad. What can you tell me about Camp Alton?
Camp Alton was the first state prison in Illinois. When there was a smallpox outbreak, a hospital was built on a nearby island in the Mississippi River to quarantine the infected.
Oh my, smallpox again? So far these camps sound really bad for health. What about Camp Elmira?
Camp Elmira was in New York. It was set up for only 6,000, but over 10,000 prisoners arrived, which led to some prisoners camping along the Chemung River.
Sounds like there were a lot of prisoners during the Civil War. Camps had so much overflow. How bad were the conditions in Camp Andersonville?
Oh my, do not get me started.
Uh-oh.
This camp was in Georgia. The main water source became polluted by human waste, making the perfect bacteria breeding ground and causing disease to spread. The camp held 35,000 more prisoners than designed for, and 13,000 of the prisoners died due to exposure, starvation, and brutality. Luckily, the commander of Andersonville was executed for war crimes after the war.
Oh my gosh, these camps sound terrible. There's only one last camp I'm going to ask you about. What do you know about Belle Isle Prison Camp in Virginia?
Unfortunately, prisoners in that camp suffered from chronic diarrhea, scurry, frostbite, starvation, and neglect.
Well, it is absolutely mind-blowing to hear how awful these conditions were.
Yes. Luckily, prison reform efforts built safer and more sanitary prisons in the USA after 12 to 16% of Civil War prisoners died.
Yes, well, that is good, at least. Well, now that we know a little bit more about what prison camps were like during the Civil War, let's get back to hear about some of the gruesome battles. In the Battle of Vicksburg, General Ulysses Grant commanded Union forces to find a way to take Vicksburg from the western bank of the river, but they were turned back by Confederate troops. Admiral David Porter ran a flotilla of gunboats and barges past Confederate forces at Vicksburg under cover at night under Grant's orders. Grant's troops marched northeastward and then doubled back toward Vicksburg and cut the city off from the east side. It took only 3 weeks for Grant's men to march 180 miles, win 5 battles, and capture 6,000 prisoners. Residents began to starve, and the Confederate general surrendered on July 4th of 1863. The Union's victory at the Battle of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi Valley, and these events convinced Lincoln of Grant's outstanding military ability. The Battle of Gettysburg started when Robert E. Lee on the Confederate side realized that the North had the manpower advantage, which was possibly wearing out his Confederate troops. He decided a victory in attack would likely boost his troops' spirits. He commanded the troops to invade the North in June 1863. They advanced into Pennsylvania, where they met Meade's troops on the Union side at the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee at first succeeded in sending the Union troops into retreat, but when reinforcements arrived for both sides on July 1st, the Union troops, about 90,000, outnumbered the Confederates, about 75,000. On July 3rd, Lee ordered Major General Pickett and about 15,000 of his men to attack the Union troops on a plain just below the hill in hopes to surround Union forces. The Union fought back and killed or wounded over half of Pickett's troops. Lee retreated, crossing the Potomac River to Virginia. After the battle, President Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address on the exact battle site as a tribute to the loss of so many men.
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this new continent and a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here who have gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether filtering and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot considerate, we cannot hallow this ground. These brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have considerated it far above our poor power to add or distract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but we can never forget what they did here. It is for us that living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause from which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Ulysses Grant was named the commanding general of the Union Army. Grant came up with a plan to wear out the Confederacy using a series of attacks. General William T. Sherman captured Atlanta in 1864. Atlanta was the Confederate railroad hub and industrial center. Sherman marched 62,000 troops through Georgia, his main goal to destroy Southern property, crops, and other supplies. In 1865, Sherman and his troops made their way up north through South Carolina and battled Confederate troops. The Confederacy challenged Sherman in North Carolina, but his troops fought back and gained the upper hand. Sherman waged a brutal and destructive total war against the Confederacy. Sherman and his troops did not burn down Savannah like they had with Atlanta. The definite reason is still unknown to this day. Grant was even more determined to capture Richmond after Sherman's success because Richmond was the Confederate capital. The Battle of the Wilderness was fought in a heavily wooded area west of Fredericksburg and north of Richmond. This battle lasted for 2 days and resulted in heavy injury on the Union side. Grant still refused to retreat and moved his army more south instead, but he was followed by Lee. Grant attacked Lee's troops on May 8, 1864, and this battle lasted for 12 days. The Union Army outnumbered the Confederates by 6,000 men. Lee and Grant collided again on Cold Harbor. The Union lost 10,500 more men than the Confederates did. In 1865, Grant's forces broke through the last line of defenses into Richmond, and the city fell on April 3rd. Confederate troops and government officials set fire to parts of the city on their way out, so the Union people couldn't use it as shelter. The Union still took control of their remains, and Lincoln even came to see for himself. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens met with President Lincoln on February 3, 1865. Lincoln demanded that the Confederacy surrender completely, but Stephens refused, so war continued. The Union cavalry surrounded General Robert E. Lee and his troops near the Appomattox Courthouse. After a brief battle, Lee agreed to surrender. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in the Appomattox Courthouse. Lee accepted Grant's terms of surrender. All Confederate officers and soldiers were pardoned. Grant even made sure that Lee's starving Confederates would receive the Union's rations. It was official. The Union had won.
Congress passed the 13th Amendment on January 1865. 3/4 of states had already approved it by December, and the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, ending slavery. However, African Americans were not guaranteed full equality. until the 14th Amendment. The last Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th, granted voting rights to African Americans. Following the Civil War, the United States faced a deep economic divide as the devastated South struggled to replace its lost plantation system with a new labor model, eventually following into the restrictive cycle of sharecropping and black peonage. In contrast, the North experienced a massive industrial boom, bolstered by federal initiatives like the Morrill Act and the Homestead Act, which expanded higher education and Western settlement. Despite these advancements and the vital educational efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau, the nation faced a long, difficult road to political and social recovery as it transitioned into a leading industrial power. People in the South didn't want to accept that 13th Amendment. In fact, they didn't like it so much that they started making these things called black codes that would limit black people even further. It was a pretty rough year for the people in America. Lincoln was dead.
Stop dologizing!
People in the United States of America were very distraught about Lincoln's death and the war that had happened earlier. So the new president, Andrew Johnson, gained the responsibility of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was a pretty odd choice. Republicans voted him, but they didn't know that he was actually really, really racist. The radical Republicans had a plan to take the Reconstruction responsibilities from him. They started this plan called Radical Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 stripped power from Southern governments, placing the region under military rule and requiring new state constitutions that ratified the 14th Amendment. This era saw the rise of scalawags, Southern white Republicans, and carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved south. The power struggle peaked when President Johnson defied the Tenure of Office Act by firing his Secretary of War. This led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives.
Ulysses S. Grant, the great Union hero of the Civil War, won the 1868 presidential election. He received the votes of about 500,000 African Americans, which helped him receive 53% of the ballots. Republicans pushed for the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment completed the political reforms sought by Reconstruction when it was approved in February 1869. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment provided citizenship rights and full equality for anyone born in the United States. In conclusion, the Civil War was a very devastating time for the American people. A lot of men and money were lost. In total, the Union spent $3 billion on the war, while the Confederacy spent about $1 billion. About 620,000 lives were lost. Most of those lives were not lost from being in battle, but were actually lost from diseases such as typhoid fever, smallpox, diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria, measles, and tuberculosis. Morphine was used to ease soldiers' pain, but unfortunately, many became addicted to the drug. Even though a lot of information on the Civil War was presented today, there are simply too many details of the Civil War to fit in one 25-minute documentary. Which is why my final challenge for you is to go out and see what other information you can find for yourself. And in other words, that was a Chai Tea documentary on the Civil War. We hope you enjoyed.